I think it's awesome that you shared that, Ken. Actually, I heard about that they were going to share this about praying for the pastor, and I heard about that, and I said, yeah, that confirmed what I was preparing tonight. Now I'm gonna share to you a story about King David, and if it's all right with you, I'm just gonna share this. It's gonna be like a storytelling night, if that's okay. Okay, I'm just gonna run through this story, and it's just the story of King David. A lot of us know that story, but I'm just gonna go through it again quickly to remind you of some things. Because not only do I think this story about King David, not only do I think it's a story in the Bible and God did amazing things, but I truly believe that this is our story today. And I hope you'll see that as I go through this. This is where we are as a people, as a church today. We are this story. Okay? So I'm just going to start with Romans 15, verse 4. And this kind of just shows us. For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through endurance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So King David is something that was written in the past. It was written to teach us. Through endurance, encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So that's what we're going to do tonight. And I'm going to tell a story about King David. And we're going to start at a certain point in the story. This is the point that I want to end at, but we're going to start at this point, because it seems like a good thing to do. 1 Samuel 22, verses 1 to 2. So David got away and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and others associated with his family heard where he was, they came down and joined him. Not only that, but all who were down on their luck came around. Losers and vagrants and misfits of all sorts. David became their leader. There were about 400 in all. See how this is getting to be our story? This is us, but we'll get to there. I'll explain to you that. So as I'm going through this story about David, I want you guys to keep in the back of your mind that this is our story, okay? And I want you guys to see the similarities in this and where we're at today. Not only in general, but this moment, where we are right now today, this week. This is where we are. And David, I want you guys to keep in your mind that David, Pastor Terry, might be kind of like a David. And so are we, and so are other people, and so is Jesus. But just keep in mind that Pastor Terry, he can be King David for tonight. So David's been anointed king over Israel. Samuel has pulled out the flask, dumped oil over his head, anointed him. That happened when he was about 10 to 13 years of age. But right here, he's about 29 or something like that, years old, and he's in a cave. He got away because Saul's chasing him. And I'm going to go through the background history so we know where this is. But David has been anointed king, and he is hiding in a cave. And all the people, the misfits, the rabble-rousers, gather around him, right? And he's in this cave, but he's been anointed king. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of history. So we're going to go into the background of this. And as I've been reading this and studying this, I see so clearly, and over the past few years I have seen this more clearly, that God's ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. His ways are perfect. Right? We expect certain things. But God always does what's right. He always does the perfect, the right thing. He does the thing that'll work out best in the end. Not necessarily the thing that'll work out best at the moment. He does what will work out best overall. And not only the best, in the end for my life, but the best overall for the world. And that's his goal. And that comes clearly and clearly and clearly the more I read about his ways. So this is his story, and this is the background of where David is right now. Right? Eli is the priest over Israel. And if you guys, most of you know the story. But Eli is the priest. He is kind of the ruler. Israel has no king at this point. So Eli is kind of taking that role. His two sons are also serving with him at the temple. Now his sons aren't doing the right thing, right? You all know Eli's sons. They're sleeping with the girls that tend at the gate of the temple. They're taking the meat of the offerings before it's cooked. Bad. They have no regard for God. And as I'm explaining Israel's condition here, I want you to see our condition and Canada's condition, right? So the priest has some sort of godliness, right? He knows right and wrong. He knows that what his sons are doing is wrong, but he doesn't restrain them, and he doesn't, he's kind of getting older. And it actually said that if we go to 1 Samuel 3 verse 1, it says, "And the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. right? So this is the era and what Eli is doing. He's serving, but the word of the Lord is precious. There's no really big open vision. So you can kind of imagine his mindset and his countenance, you know. He's trying to serve. He knows what the right thing is to do, but there's no open vision. God doesn't seem real. And I think it probably has a lot to do with the fact of his sons, not only his sons, but all of Israel. You can see reading through this, and if you guys want to read through this later on, that'll be awesome. I don't have to spend more time on that. I can just go through it. But the people were still bringing sacrifices. They were still bringing offerings. But if you read later on in the story, after the Ark of God gets captured and brought back, Samuel has to address the people and say, if you're truly ready to return to the Lord, put away all your idols, put away all this stuff, and serve the Lord only, right? So it wasn't that they weren't serving God. Right, if you read the beginning of 1 Samuel, you'll see that the people were coming regularly to the temple. They were offering their worship. They were offering sacrifices, even though they were getting stolen and taken and doing the right way. But the industry of the temple was still moving, right? But the leadership was corrupted, and the people weren't serving God only. They still had all their other gods and fertility gods and things like that. So that's what we're looking at in this time. Now, Hannah comes. Hannah comes to the temple. You guys all know about Hannah, Samuel's mother. She cries for a son because she was barren up until this point, and her husband had another wife who had lots of kids and had sons, and she was just she wanted to have a son. And her husband loved her, so she knew, she had her husband, but she wanted to have a son. So she went to God, and the yearly time they went up to offer the sacrifices, and she cries out to God for a son. Give me a son, Lord, give me a son. And Eli thinks she's drunk, and he says, go away, you're drinking too much. And she says, no, I'm just crying out to God, I want a son. And he says, may he grant you what you request. So she gets a son, right? She comes back the next year with a son. And this is also what I see about, in our time, in Canada too, not even Canada, North America, the world, there are still things happening in the body of Christ, right? We see Kyle last night. Only God could have done that. We see us standing here right now. We've all been saved. We've all been set free. We're all getting, closer and closer. We're all getting to understand who Jesus is. There are things happening, right? And just like in this portion of Scripture, there was miracles happening, right? It wasn't throughout the whole land. The whole land wasn't, like we see, right? We don't see the churches coming together like we know we want to have. We know what God wants us to have. We don't see the miracles like we know we should have, right? We do see good things. Me and Josh said the other night, but we went to Regina, and this lady had a healing ministry. And a lot of people got healed. You could see them get healed. You could see the look on their faces. But there were several people in wheelchairs that left in wheelchairs, right? So just like this, Hannah cried for a son. She got a son, but other people weren't getting what they were wanting. There was no open visions. That's where we are. So, Eli and his sons... Samuel comes, right? God gives Samuel to his mother. He comes, starts serving in the temple, and this is the first, you guys all know the story about Samuel. He was sleeping close to the Ark of God. He gets this voice. He hears the voice of God. God tells him what he's about to do in Israel. He said, I'm going to make a switch. I've seen the corruption. I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm not going to let this go through. I'm going to remove the leadership, and I'm going to raise for myself up a priest who will do what I want him to do. He was talking about Samuel. And so he says this, and it quickly comes to pass. Eli and his sons die. Actually, what happened was the Ark of God got captured. And the people finally realized their state that they were in. Because up until this point, it was business as usual. The people thought, that they were doing a good job. Finally, the Ark of God, which represented the presence of God, gets captured, right? And that to them was the presence of God with Israel. This is what's going to help us win. This is what it's all about. But when the Ark of God left, they finally realized that God had left long before the Ark, right? He had left long before the Ark. This was just them realizing it, God and showing them where they're at. And so the Ark gets captured. Eli dies as a result of hearing not about his sons dying, but about the Ark of God getting captured. That shows you his heart. So the Ark of God and the leaders die, and Samuel starts to become the prophet, right? Because now the people are getting desperate. They know their situation. They know where they're going. And Samuel has a perfect track record. right? Samuel hears the voice of God. Samuel delivers the voice of God, and it happens, right? So Samuel's the new leader. The people begin, when Samuel gets a little bit older, the people ask for a king. Because even though Samuel was righteous and Samuel was doing what he was supposed to, his sons growing up weren't. They were beginning to do what Eli's sons were doing. So the people go to Samuel and say, look, your sons, you're getting old. Your sons are not the men that you are. So give us a king. We want a king. So Samuel goes to God and says, the people have asked for a king. And God says, you know what? They've rejected me as a king. Give them a king. Right? He says, do what they're asking to do. And a lot of times that's how I feel like, sometimes God, that's what he says in our generation, Like we create these things and we have these buildings and we have these traditions, right? And we say, we want to have this stuff. We want to do this. And God says, you're really rejecting me as king, but have it. If that's what you really want, have it. You can have it your way. And so that's what happens. And Saul, you guys all know about Saul. Saul becomes king. Samuel goes and he does the same thing. He takes out his oil and he dumps it over Saul's head, and he anoints him king. And there's a period of time where Saul is not king yet, but he becomes king. And so Saul is now the new king. And actually, it's not like a bad thing. God is kind of frustrated with the people that they asked for a king. He wanted to be their king. But because they had a king, wasn't a big deal. He said, no, it's okay. If you obey your king, and if your king obeys me, and that's the verse that says in the Bible, then I will be with Israel. Don't worry about it. I know you did something wrong, but I forgive you. Just follow your king and make sure your king follows me, and everything will be good. But Saul doesn't do that, does he? Right? Saul starts to do things his own way. There's a couple instances that I can think of off the top of my head where he's waiting for Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice to seek God because they're going into battle. And Saul gets flustered. He sees his men leaving, so he offers the sacrifice. And Samuel comes just as he finishes and says, "What have you done? Because you have not obeyed God, he's looking for another person. He's got his eyes and he's searching for another king." And so that's what God is doing. He's looking for another king. And Saul kind of just gets worse and worse and worse as time goes on. God comes to Saul and through Samuel and says, "I want you to kill the Amalekites. I'm going to get them back for what they've done to Israel in the past. So you go and kill them. Kill everything. Don't leave anything alive. The children, the animals, everything, you go and kill." So Saul goes out and he kills them mostly. Right? He goes in and he kills, all the soldiers, and he kills that. But the choicest of animals he keeps for himself, and his men keep for themselves. And the king he leaves alive. Probably because he wants to parade him around as, I captured this king, I defeated this, right? He didn't do what God asked. And here's the crazy thing, is that Samuel comes to Saul, and he goes looking for Saul because he's heard God said, "I'm so frustrated with Saul. I am regretting choosing him as king." So Samuel hears this from God, and he goes to Saul, and he says, "Saul, like, what are you doing?" But he goes to meet him, and Saul had already left to go build a monument for himself, a victory monument to himself. So Samuel's just frustrated, and you can kind of see Samuel's frustration because he's Saul's mentor, right? He's giving all of God's words to Saul. He's helping him, and he's trying his hardest. And he goes to meet Saul, and Saul's off building a monument to himself. So you can kind of see Samuel, Saul. So he goes up to Saul, and he's mad, right? He's mad on his mind, and he goes to Saul, and Saul greets him and says, "God's blessings on you. I have done what God has asked me to the letter." Right? And that's where Saul's at. That's where his mindset is. Right? He's thinking that he's doing God's will to the letter. And I think there's probably some demons got a hold of him, and his pride got a hold of him, and he's not doing things the right way. So Samuel goes, "What is this I hear? I hear all the animals. I hear this. I see the king that you've left alive." And Saul goes, "What? What am I doing wrong?" He said, "Isn't it, what? So what? I kept some of the animals. I was just going to sacrifice them to God. What's so wrong about that?" And you can kind of see that attitude. I'm doing the right thing. And this is what Samuel tells him in 1 Samuel 15:20-23. I think I gave you that, Kyla. Yes. Saul defended himself. "What are you talking about? I did obey God. I did the job God set for me. I brought him in King Agag and destroyed the Amalekites under the terms of the holy band. So the soldiers saved back a few choice sheep and cattle from the holy band for sacrifice to God at Gilgal. What's wrong with that? Then Samuel said, do you think all God wants are sacrifices, empty rituals just for show? He wants you to listen to him. He wants you to listen to him. Plain listening is the thing, not staging a lavish religious production. Not doing what God tells you is far worse than fooling around in the occult. Getting self-important around God is far worse than making deals with your dead ancestors. Because you said no to God's command, he says no to your kingship. And these are strong words, but I see our situation, and I see our land, in this story. God is saying, I don't want the religious productions. I want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to my word. I don't want any of that other stuff. And that's what we talk about religion so bad, right? Is because God says right here, he says that religious motions is worse than the occult. It's worse, right? Just staging the whole production in the name of God is worse than anything the people are doing in the world. And that's the way that God sees things. That's not the way that we see things, right? That's the way that God looks at things. So what does God do? Or what does Samuel do? He leaves Saul. And he announces this to Saul, and he says, I'm out of here. And he left Saul. He no longer helped Saul. God had already taken his hand off Saul, but this time Samuel leaves Saul. And the amazing thing that comes out when I read this story is that Saul is still king. He's still king. I don't know how long this is. I don't know how many years have gone by. But from the moment that God said, I'm looking for another person, he left Saul in charge. And that's the thing that always goes through my head, that God's ways aren't our ways, We think that, God, if you don't want someone to be in power, take them out. Put someone you want in there. That's not God's thinking, right? God's thinking is, I'm going to go, there's a process to what God wants to do, and I think, Saul didn't understand that because he rushed on things. David is a man who understood that, and I'm going to show that to you, right? So, God finds David. And David is, at this time in the story, he's about 10 to 13 years old. And I got that from a kind of a timeline. And because David is the most written about from start to the finish of his life, is the most complete person in the Bible that's ever written about. So we know a lot about David's life. We know about the years. We know about what he did. Even the Psalms kind of shows us who David was. And so David is a 10 to 13 years old. He's in charge of his father's sheep. Right, that's what he is. He's not a big time, he has lots of brothers. He's the youngest of all his brothers. Terry, what are you in the place of all your brothers? Youngest, okay. Youngest of all the brothers. So he's the youngest of all. He's just taking care of the sheep. He's being, up until this point, as far as we know, he's just being faithful, right? He's doing what his father told him to do. He's tending the sheep. He's not trying to be anything more than he is. His brothers are, older and more, they're in the army and they're doing stuff. He's just taking care of the sheep. And so when Samuel goes to anoint David, he sees his other brothers and he says, surely this is the king that God's chosen. And God says, no, I look at the heart. I don't look at the outward appearance. I look at the heart. This is someone that I'm going to choose, and it's going to be a man after my own heart. And that's a lot different from when he chose Saul, because Saul was a head taller than everyone else in Israel. Saul was the perfect looking king. And I think God, the first time he chose a king, he chose it more kind of towards what the people wanted for a king, right? Good looking, big, from a good family, this is who he chose, right? But this time's different. He already been through. He says, this is what the people wanted. They wanted Saul. I thought I could train him. I tried to train him. I tried to tell him. But this time's going to be different. This time I'm going to pick someone after my own heart. And it's not going to be who everyone else expects. And it's not going to be the prettiest face or whatever. It's going to be a man after my own heart. And so Samuel meets David, gets brung in from the pasture, and he anoints him with oil. And he says, you are going to be king over Israel. And what does David do? He goes back to feeding the sheep. This is over and over and over and over again in this story. This is what I see God doing, right? God chooses something. He ordains something. He gives something. He says, I am anointed you. You are going to be king over this nation. He's the 10 to 13-year-old boy, right? You are king over this nation. What does he do? He goes back to serving the sheep, and Saul remains the king over Israel. So sometimes we think, well, God's given us a vision. God's told us things, right? We heard Ken talk about the vision that God has given Pastor Terry, and it has been given a vision, right? Even today after worship, when we were talking, he said about this whole town getting saved. What would it be like? What would it look like? What would it sound like when all these people, all the people that we see every day, come and start worshiping God together? And some of us would look at that or think about that and say, oh yeah, that's awesome. And then after a while not see it happen and be like, you know what? Maybe that's not supposed to happen, or maybe that's not the vision. But you don't hear him speaking like that, right? You don't hear that vision going off to the side just because you can't see it happen this night, right? He's given you a vision, and he spoke, and he's announced what he is going to do. And that's enough, right? That's enough for us to keep going. It's not for what we see. It's not we have to have all these little signs pointing to this is what's right. It's he spoke it to our leader, and that's enough for us. And so that's what happened to Samuel, or to King David, sorry. He's anointed as king. God has declared, this is the man who I've chosen. And Saul has the reins. Okay, so a few years later, 5 years later, I kind of jumped over a whole bunch of stories, but basically Saul is still in his own same mindset. He kind of repents. He feels bad. He repents. He turns back. Samuel, help me, pray for me, come worship with me. And Samuel says, no, but then he goes and does anyway. But, he still is doing what he wants to do and what he thinks best. And, there's been some times where he's been defeated and he knows that God has left him, so he's kind of wavering right now, right? He's still king and he's still, ruling in leadership like he wants, but he knows in the back of his mind that I'm not the king anymore. So Goliath comes in. The Philistines attack Israel, right? And we all know this story, David and Goliath, right? So Goliath comes, the Philistines come, and Goliath comes out, and he's cursing God, and he's saying all this stuff, that they're going to kill him and all this stuff. And the Israelite army is shaking, and they're kind of unsure about themselves, right? And a lot of us look at that circumstance and be like, oh, they have no faith, look at who God is, look at what they did in Egypt, look at what this, but you got to understand their mindset. Their king has been rejected by God. Their king, they know what's right, they know that they're the chosen people, but their king is, wavering, and so are they, right? Because God isn't really with them at this point. So you can understand why this huge giant comes out and he's cursing the Israelites. You can understand where they are right now, right? So this is about 4 years after David had been anointed king. And he's still with the sheep. Sometimes he's helping out his brothers, and sometimes he's playing music for Saul. And so I'm just going to read 1 Samuel 30, or what do I have there? What's the next one I have there, Kyla? What's that? No, the next one. Sure. We'll see what that is. Oh, no. We'll go to the next one. Sorry. Yes. Yeah, we'll do that. Okay, so David comes into the camp, and he's still doing his thing. He's still being obedient. He's still being faithful. And he comes, and he brings stuff for his brothers, and he overhears Goliath saying these things. So he says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Well, first thing he says is, what is the king going to do for whoever kills this Philistine? And, that kind of shows me where he's at, right? He's 15 to 17 years old. So he's looking at this, and, in the back of his mind, we know that he's been protecting the sheep. He's been killing bears. He's been killing lions, right? So he's feeling rambunctious, He's a man after God's own heart, right? So he looks at Goliath, and he says, first thing that comes into his mind, what's the king going to do for someone who kills this guy? He's kind of thinking, what can I get out of this, And not, just saying it kind of shows where David is in his youth. And then he says, and who is this giant anyway, cursing the armies of the living God, right? Who is this guy? So he's going around asking, and his brothers are saying, oh, you're just trying to get battle, whatever. But the thing is that his brothers saw him get anointed. They were there when Samuel poured the oil over David's head. So I think they're a bit jealous too. And they're like, get out of here, David. He's still young. But anyway, so the things David was saying were picked up and reported to Saul. Saul sent for him. Master, said David, don't give up hope. I'm ready to go and fight this Philistine. I'm ready to go. Right, and the first thing that Saul is like, come on, look at this guy. He's been fighting since before you were born. But this is what David says to him in So Saul answered David, you can't go and fight this Philistine. You're too young and inexperienced, and he's been at this fighting business since before you were born. David said, I've been a shepherd, tending my sheep for my father. Whenever a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I'd go after it, knock it down, and rescue the lamb. If it turned on me, I'd grab it by the throat, wring its neck, and kill it. Lion or bear, it made no difference. I killed it. And I'll do the same to this Philistine pig who's taunting the troops of God alive. David, a man after God's own heart, right? That's who's saying this. The man after God's own heart is saying, you know what? And you know what this does to Saul? Saul said, go and God help you, right? Saul knows who God is. Saul knows how God delivered him in his battles that he fought. Saul remembers the great king of Israel that helped him at the time where he was chosen, that God did have his hand on him. He remembers that, so that's still in his memory. Saul knows who God is. So when David comes out and says, he comes up with something like this, that memory comes back to Saul's head. The king of Israel comes clear in his mind, and he says, go, right? Because who in their right mind, right? A king with no experience or whatever wouldn't have said that, right? They wouldn't have said go because he's a 15-year-old boy, and it's a big giant. But because he knew who God was, he said, go, may God be with you, right? So David goes. He goes out to Goliath, and I'm going to bring this out. This is going to get your attention. All right. After I'm done with this, can you wrap it up and put it beside here? After I'm done. So this is the sword of Goliath, just so you know. Okay, so David goes out to meet Goliath, and just a rambunctious little kid. And I really start to see why God calls him a man after his own heart, because this is the heart of God. That David runs up or goes out to meet Goliath, and Goliath is like, what is this? He starts to laugh. Like he's cursing, and there's someone coming, running out from the lines, and he's still right. But it's so short that first he doesn't really pay any attention, right? This little kid, and then it starts to get closer, and then he kind of stops and looks, and there David is, and he's like, right? Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And listen to what David says. It says, what's the next one I have? Yeah. David says to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Right? It's not enough just to strike him down. He's got to cut out the guy's head off. Okay? This is a man after God's own heart. Remember? Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Hallelujah. Now you have to have a history with God to say something like this. You can't just come off with this on the top of your head, reading something out of a book, or hearing someone else talk about God. You have to know, and right? So he's been learning. He's been anointed as king, and he's been practicing using that anointing, using his kingship, using the hand of God, not in the kingship yet, right? He's used it against the lion. He's used it against the bear, right? Because it says that when Samuel poured the oil over David, it said that the Spirit of the Lord came heavy on him and filled him and empowered him from that day on, right? So this isn't just some kid running around, with the sheep killing bears and lions, right? Because he's a young kid, right? But this is God's anointed, whose God's Spirit has rested on, right? And he's going out, he's killing, and he's practicing, and he's getting ready to be a king far before he even becomes a king, right? And that's the plan of God. That's the plan of God in our lives. That's the plan of God in this church, right? We've heard a story, we've heard a vision, we've been given, everyone has heard God's voice. Everyone sees his plan for this community and this nation, right? But sometimes we find ourselves like David. We're still tending the sheep, right? But David never thought, for a moment, he didn't think, I should be in the king, or we don't get that from the Bible. He didn't say, I should be leading, I should be going out to war, I should be doing the battles. He didn't say that. He did what he was commanded and told to do by his father. And that's, hallelujah. So anyways, David, we all know it. David takes a rock, puts it in the swing, throws it, nails Goliath right in the forehead, right? Boom, that's a good shot. I don't care who you are, that's a good shot. So it drills in, goes down. What does David do? David runs over to Goliath, takes out his sword, and chops his head off. Just like he said he was going to do, right? But this sword is pretty big. He's a 15-year-old boy, right? So it's probably not like shing, right? Like I'm doing it. It's probably like, right? But he gets it done nonetheless, right? He does what he says he's going to do. And what does he do? He takes Goliath's head and he says he takes it to Israel. He takes it to the city. He wants to parade this head around Israel. He wants to say, look at what the Lord did. Not look what I did, right? Look what the Lord has done. Look at, there is a God in Israel. And so this is how David is thinking, you know. And if you listen to men like David Hogan, you know, he talks about taking demons' heads and parading them through the streets of Jerusalem. And a lot of people would think that's crazy. But this is David, a man after God's own heart, who just cut off the head of a giant and wants to go parade it through the streets of Israel. So who's crazier? Us for thinking it's crazy to carry our head around, or David Hogan for being just like a man after God's own heart? Right? There's a difference. It's not what we think, it's what God thinks. So it says that David puts the Goliath's sword and he puts his weapons in his own tent. Right? He takes him for himself. And what happens was the Israelites go and they kill all the Philistines and they chase them down. And Saul is asking about this young David because he's had David play music to him and stuff like that. But he says, who is this David? And so the commander of his army goes and gets David, brings David to him. Who knows how long after the army or after he killed Goliath? Might have been a couple minutes, might have been a couple hours. But when David comes before the king, you know, he comes up, the king's here, he comes up, he still has Goliath's head in his hand. It says that in the Bible. He's still carrying it. He hasn't let it go, right? He still is parading this head around, bleeding, and like who knows what it would look like. But this is a man after God's own heart. And so he comes with the head in his hand, right? So David gets promoted, right? He starts beginning to see and realize, and he starts to experience what Samuel did to him 5 years before. He didn't see any of it come to pass. Except, well, actually he did. He saw it in the lion. He saw it in the bear, right? So he started to see. Now he's in this place of authority. Saul, because everyone respects him, they know that God's hand is upon him. Saul makes him commander of the military affairs. And everyone knows that God is with David, right? They sing, Saul killed by the thousands, David kills by the 10,000s, right? So already David's beginning to get a higher and a higher place. The time is coming, right? David's time is coming, but it's not his time yet, right? And I think, you know, we can, you know, as I'm reading this story, just think about where we are today. Think about, you know, the visions that God's given us, and think the victories that we have, right? We've seen some lions killed. We've seen some bears killed, right? We've killed some bears. We've went in there, right? We've taken back some lambs. We've went in there, right? And but it's not fulfilled yet. But David's time is coming. And so finally, after several, you know, Saul is still in his mindset. He tries to kill David. We all know, you know, Saul, he throws a spear at David. He sends him out, thinks he'll get killed by the Philistines. He asks for 100 foreskins for the life of his, or to marry his daughter, right? Because he's never going to do that. You know, sends him out. But David, always victorious, 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 victorious. And all this time, David's just doing what he's told, right? He's not trying to get in the kingship. He's not trying to bunch his way in, even though the people love him. He's doing whatever Saul commands him to do. He's very humble. And so after several attempts on his life from Saul, you know, finally, I think David and Saul's son Jonathan are realizing that, you know, I think Saul is going to stop at nothing before David's dead and killed. So what happens? You know, finally David and Jonathan realize that Saul will stop at nothing to kill him. So they weep together, right? And at this time, David was still the commander of lots of stuff in Saul's kingdom, but finally they realize, you know, Saul's going to kill me, I have to leave. So he goes into hiding, right? He goes into hiding. And this is now, David is about 29 years old. Okay, 29. The story goes by really quick in the Bible, you know. We read it, it's the next chapter. But really, in reality, 10 years goes by, right? David's 10 to 13 years old. Say he's 13, he gets anointed. So Samuel anoints him. He spends 5 years, and then he kills Goliath, right, when he's 15 to 17 years old. After he kills Goliath, he gets promoted, and all this stuff goes on. He's going and, leading the army of Israel. 10 years this goes on. 10 years. So this is 15 years in total from him getting anointed. So 10 years goes by, and David finds himself, still not king. He's still not the king, right? Saul is still in king, still in leadership. 15 years it's been since Samuel poured the oil on his head and the hand's been lifted off Saul. 15 years. And Saul is still in kingship, right? And sometimes we think that, we know what God's planning to do in Canada, right? But why? Why is this? And it was 15 years for this to happen. But God's ways aren't our ways. His thoughts aren't our thoughts. And we have to, what did he say? I just want you to listen to me. I don't want David didn't try and push his way into this, right? We're not trying to push our way into the visions and the direction that God's leading us, right? We're doing step by step what he is calling us to do. And we're doing it in a way that's not offensive, to let's say the religious system, right? We're not trying to make a bad name to the religious system, They're obviously, right, just like David said, whenever he spoke about Saul, he says, I will not touch God's anointed, right? So that's the attitude that we have to have with the religious system right now, right? Yeah, the hand of God's lifted off upon them. Yeah, he's anointed, and I'm not saying people or churches or anything like that. I'm just saying about the whole system in general, the religious system. Right? Yeah, it's time is over, right? God's looking for a new king. He's looking for new leaders. He's looking for new people, right? But obviously it's still in place at the moment, widespread, not here, widespread. So we're not saying anything about it, right? We're just doing what God's commanded us to do, We won't speak anything bad against them. In our sight, they're as good as God because they're in leadership, so obviously God wants them there, right? Right? Like it's not for us to judge people. It's for God to judge people. So this is where David is, right? He's still, and now he's going to hiding. So not only is he not king, but he is on the run. He is running from Saul. And he runs, and it's been 10 long years, or whatever, it's been longer, it's been 15 years, but 10 years, he's been struggling, and Saul's tried to kill him, and he's only been doing what God's told him to do. And now he's on the run, by himself. He has no one with him. He doesn't even have a weapon. He's on the run. And where does he go? He goes to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And this is a regular thing for David to do. David always goes to the priest. He always seeks after God. It says about Saul, it says that he built an altar later on, after he was a king. And it specifically says, and that was Saul's first time of building an altar. And all the time he's been king, this is the first time that he decided to build an altar to God. But David wasn't like that, right? David was a man after God's own heart. He was seeking after God. He was building altars all the time. He was singing songs. And in 1 Samuel 21, 1 to 10, this is what happens. David is now on the run. It's been a long time coming, right? We have to realize that we read this really fast, but this is a huge period of time, 10 years, right? 10 years has gone by. That's half of a lot of our lives. So then, what happens? David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Or here. Can you put this back for me? I forgot about that. David went to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him, right? Ahimelech knows who David is. And he says, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? David answered Ahimelech the priest, the king charged me with a certain matter and said to me, no one is to know anything about your mission and your instructions. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find. But the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women. David replied, indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's things are holy even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today? So the priests gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord, and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. Let's stop there for a second. So David's on the run, right? He goes to the priest, and I can hear, okay, I don't know if you can hear this, but I can hear an uncertainty a little bit about him, right? He's lying about what's going on, right? Right? So that's kind of your first sign that he's not kind of, not 100% confident, in what's going on. He's still faithful, right? He still trusts God. He still has the zeal. But underneath it all, he's kind of unsure, right? Because he's not telling the truth to the priest. He's not saying his true condition. He's saying, this is what's, don't worry, he's trying to, he knows that God's going to do something, right? But he doesn't know when or how or why. So he's this is the place that he's in. Okay, next slide. Now, one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeg the Edomite, Saul's head shepherd. David asked Ahimelech, don't you have a spear or a sword here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's business was urgent. So here's King David, right? No weapon, right? The great King David, who's killed so many, has all these followers, has the army in his command. I don't even have a weapon, I'm not sure he wasn't like that, but so because the king's business was urgent. Next one. The priest replied, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There's no sword here other than that one. What does David say? David said, there is none like it. Give it to me, right? So the priest, there's only one sword there. Obviously, David didn't know that the sword was there. Like maybe he did in the past, but he had forgotten about it or whatever. This is 10 years later since Goliath, right? And maybe it circled around whatever, but it ended up there. So David ends up in this temple with this priest, and the sword of Goliath, which he killed 10 years ago, is there. And it's the only sword there, right? And you can hear it in the priest's voice, him saying, I only have this one sword. But what does David say? There is none like it. Give it to me, right? So the priest brings out this sword. It's wrapped in a cloth, probably hasn't been used since the day that the Goliath died, right? He has this sword, and David says, give it to me. And he takes it out, and he gets it in his hands. And this is something that I think about all the time. David is sitting there with this sword in his hand, right? And the second he touches it, you know how it is. The second he touches it, all the memories start to rush back into his mind, right? He looks at this sword, and it's probably still got Goliath's blood on it. And he says, there's where I cut off his head, right? And he remembers, and think about this with me for a second. I want you guys to get this, okay? This is awesome, right? He's looking at this sword, and think about this as a movie, right? Okay, it's a movie. He's looking at this, and the shot's on David, and all of a sudden there's this flashback, right? This flashback, and there he is, this little 15-year-old kid or 17-year-old kid, God, right? And he's sitting there, an old man, right? 10 years later, not an old man. 10 years later, he's sitting there, and he's looking at this sword, right? And he hears the same words in his head that he spoke to Goliath, right? 1 Samuel 17, 34 to 37. He hears this playing as he's holding the sword in his hand. He hears himself saying, I'd go and knock every time they took a lamb, right? So now not only is he seeing Goliath, but he's seeing flashbacks of 15 years ago, killing 13 years old, killing this lion, right? He's seeing the flashes of the bear. He's seeing running through the hillside, right? God's Spirit flowing through him, right? Invigorating him, reviving him, empowering him. He's seeing this. And next one, I grab it by the throat, wring its neck. Lion or bear, it made no difference. I killed it. And I'll do the same to this Philistine pig. So David's sitting there with this sword of Goliath that he killed 10 years ago. And these words come into his mouth. And why did God lead David there? Well, he wanted to remind David, right? Lion or bear, it made no difference. Right? David's on the run, and God's saying, King Saul after you, no difference. The same God who killed that lion, the same God that killed that bear and delivered you, will deliver you from the hand of Saul. And he's looking, and he's getting this sword, and he's realizing. And now, not only is the sword, it's still big, but now he's 10 years older. And now he can wield it a little bit better. Right? It feels more better in his hand. That's why he says, there's none like it. Give me this sword. so he takes it. Now 10 years later, right, he couldn't really use it when he was a kid. Right, he did, and he cut off the giant's head, but he couldn't really take it around because he probably couldn't carry it, and it was taller than he was. But now, 10 years later, now I can use this sword just as good as Goliath did. Right, I've been using swords for 10 years, leading my men into battle. Now this is the perfect one for me to go again with. You know what I think of when I think of this story? I think about my life. I think about when I was a little rambunctious rabble-rouser, a little youth, 3 years ago. No, but seriously, 3 years ago, right, I came to this place, and I was just a little, kid. I didn't know what was going on. I was, held in bondage. I was, a riffraff. I was, just like what I said, the first verse I shared. That's who I was. And I came and I get this holy fire for God, right? I start to hear the voice of God speaking, what he's going to do in this community, and I start to think, yeah, right? And I go to prayer, and I go, and I wake up, we used to live in this house, and we wake up, I would wake up and, at like 5 or 6 in the morning, and I would hear Josh crying out in his basement, in our basement, crying out to God. And I'd hear it in the room beside me, and I would hear it in my room. And just stuff like this, like that's what I see, killing giants. That's what we're doing. And now 10 years later, right, this is what I read this story, right, and David's mind is flashing about the lions and the bears he's killed, but my mind is flashing back to the moments right here, crying out to God, right, being filled by his presence, by his spirit, right. I have visions of me going to Kansas City, right, and just my whole mind being blown by who God is and feeling his presence all around, and his every word that he's ever promised, never spoken, doesn't matter how big or far-fetched they may seem, they're right around the corner, right around the corner. That's what my mind goes through, but more than, that's basically what my mind goes through, and like prayer, deep prayer, and we still do it, right? It's not something that we've left behind. It's something, prayer Wednesday nights, right? When we come and meet here, when we worship our King right here up in the front, right? We've continued to do that. We've continued to seek after God. We've continued to press into his presence. But now, right, now I'm a little bit older, right? Now I'm 10 years older. And even in this, I'm talking about me and David right now, right? So now I come to prayer on Wednesday night. And now I take that sword of prayer, and I'm praying to God, and I'm worshiping to God. But now it's starting to feel a little bit steadier in my hand. Right? Like I used it before, and I prayed and I worshiped, but now it's getting to be a little bit more natural to me now, right? Now I can handle a little bit better than I did 3 years ago, right? Because I've been practicing. And, I'm still not king, and I'm still not, and our town still isn't saved, but I can sure handle this sword better than I did 10 years ago. I may be on the run, and I may be, and my people I work with, and they all might not be saved yet, but I'm doing what God has commanded me to do, and I will do it more and more. So now, old weapons. This sermon, by the way, is called Old Weapons, New Weapons, and I'm almost done, because this is the old weapon, right? This is the old weapon that God says to David, right? You remember how I worked with you for the lion and the bear? It's how I'm going to keep working with you. Yeah, it's how I'm going to keep working with you. It's how I'm going to keep delivering you. I'm the same God. I'm going to work the same way. So you take that sword, and you just go in the same faith that you had 15 years ago. You continue to do those things. You continue to trust me. And that's what God is saying to us, that 3 years ago we started this, and Pastor Terry came here 4 years ago or whatever, he said, remember those things you did. Remember crying out. Remember worshiping God. Remember getting up early in the morning to pray. Keep doing those things. Those things work. They're a weapon, right? They work. Keep doing that. Right? So that's what David is reminded of, and that he goes in that strength. And, I'm just going to skip to the end here. So now we get to 1 Samuel 22, 1-2. Right, and this is in the next chapter. David got away and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and others associated with his family heard where he was, they came down and joined him. Not only that, but all who were down on their luck came around. Losers and vagrants and misfits of all sorts. David became their leader. There were about 400 in all. Okay, there's a lot less here, but they were facing a nation. We're facing a town. Okay, so this is us. Now I'll get into the new weapons. This is the old weapon, now the new weapons. Okay? Now, in David's lifetime, this isn't, he had a lot of battles. And at this point, he's sitting in this cave, and all the people have gathered to him. The rabble-rousers, right, like we said, the misfits, the down and out, they've all gathered around David. And he's sitting in a cave. And he's got a lot of battles yet to be fought. Okay? He's got a lot of things that God's going to do. He's going to be near death many times. He's going to have to trust and seek God harder than he's ever had to before, because not only is he facing Saul, but when he gets into kingship, he's going to be facing a bunch of other things. So this is going to be a long road here for David, but he has these rabble-rousers and these people gathered around him. And later on, and I want to say that we are the rabble-rousers, and we are the misfits, and we are the down in our luck and the out. And I know a lot of us, even as early as 3 years ago, were in this place, like, we were the down and out, right? We were at the end of our rope. Right? So what did we do? We gathered around Terry, right? And the man who's God's spoken to and anointed in this time to do what he's called him to do, right? And we've gathered around him, and we don't really know what's going to happen, right? We've got a lot of battles ahead of us. Our lives are going to be this close to dying. And, we're going to have to trust and see God more than we ever have before, just like David. But I just want to go to the end of David's life, because we don't know. I'm not going to say what's going to happen tomorrow, but I'm just going to say at the end of it all, there were some men with David at that time in this cave, the down and out, that the Bible talks about later on. And I want you to turn to 1 Chronicles 11, 10 to 11. These are the chiefs of David's mighty men, the ones who linked arms with him as he took up his kingship, with all Israel joining in, helping him to become king, in just the way that God had spoken regarding Israel. The list of David's mighty men, and anyways, it just goes on to explain this list of men. But one story of David's mighty men, and you guys probably know about David's mighty men, but one story about David's mighty men was the mighty three. It said that David was in the cave of Adullam, and he said, "Man, I would like a drink from Bethlehem, the well at the Bethlehem gates." And at that time, that was a Philistine outpost. It was his home years ago. But at that time, it was a Philistine outpost. And he said that, and some of his men heard him over say that. And they went, and they fought through the lines, just 3 of them, get that water to bring it back to David. What did David do? He said, the lives that have done this for me are so precious, I'm not worthy to drink this. And he pours it out, and he gives it to God, right? He pours it out before the Lord. He says, "Far be it from me to drink this." So you see this respect and this honor happening between David and his men, right? His men will go and risk their lives. They'll do everything for David, right? But where was he? He was in the cave of Adullam, it says, when that happened. So who was the ones going out? Who was the 3 people that went out and fought through the lines to get that water, bring it back to their leader? It was the misfit. It was one of the misfits. It was one of the down on their lucks. And the other one was the whatever, just like I said in the first verse that I wrote. 1 Samuel. Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm going to lose it here. 1 Samuel 22. Not only that, but all who were down on their luck came around, losers and vagrants and misfits of all sorts. David became the leader. There were about 400 also. One of the 3 mighty men, and all of David's mighty men were in that group who came and gathered around David, right? Who came. They were down on their luck, but they were going to follow David, and David was going to be king, just like God said, in the way that he said, in the time that he said. And David, throughout this whole story, right? David was the perfect gentleman. He was respectful. He didn't kill Saul. Even when he had the chance, he said, "I'm going to let God deal with Saul," right? I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. So now, my question to us, if we are those rabble-rousers and if we are those misfits in the down and out gathered around our leader, what is it going to take and what are we going to do in order at the end of this story, at the end of when God writes about us, right? What is he going to write about us? Because we know what he wrote about the men gathered around his leader, at the end of David's life. He wrote, and they wrote about all their exploits and all the things that they did. And one of them killed 300 men. Another one killed 800 men. Another one climbed down. It says this. I think it was Benaniah. Climbed down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. That's what it says. So not only is he out killing What does the Bible say? The devil prowls around like a roaring lion, right? And this guy goes down, one of David's mighty men, climbs down into a pit, snowy day, and he kills this lion, right? He goes on the offensive, like we were saying before I started speaking. He went on the offensive. They did great things, right? And I'm just saying to you tonight that we can do great things. Yeah, we are the misfits, gathered around our leader. But at the end, when it's all said and done, what is God going to say about us? And I believe that he has a place for every one of us, right? And David not only had his mighty men, but he had the priests serving him. He had other people, that were loyal to him. And I'm not saying that all of us has to be a mighty man, but there are some mighty men in this congregation. There are some people. And I just want to give you the opportunity, and I want to give you the charge, and I want to release you to do and to be what God's called you to be. Right? To go out against 300 men. To stand your ground, it said at the threshing floor. All Israel had fled. The army had fled. And this one guy stands his ground and fights back the enemy and holds the ground. Right? That's who we can be. That's who we can be for our leader. Right? And David, I'm sure David was encouraged all the time by hearing reports about what the men did when they got back. He thought, whoa, like how amazed was he? He just said off the top of his head, I want to drink from this well. And I don't know how many hours later, they bring him this drink. And he's like, guys, I wasn't serious. I didn't tell you to go and fight and risk your lives to bring me this drink. They didn't care. They didn't care that it wasn't a direct command from their leader. They went out and did it because they wanted David to have what he said he wanted to have. Right? Imagine them talking to each other. Our leader wants a drink. Let's go get him one. Hallelujah. That's the way that we need to be, right? Pastor Terry has said he wants a house where people could come and be healed and spend time. Let's get him a house. Hallelujah. Yeah, right? Other things, whatever comes to your mind, right? Don't get your ideas from me, right? These men went and did. They had a fire inside of them, right? And let me tell you this, that David's, the sword that God gave back to David, right, to use, right? David killed the Goliath, and he was one man. But I think God realized that to take a nation and to become king, he needed more than just a sword, and he needed more than just a battle that was going to kill a Goliath. He was going to need some mighty men around him. He was going to need some help, right? And I call this message old weapons, new weapons. Now, the old ones we can't forget about. We have to still use them. We have to still fight. We have to still remember how God, we're not leaving anything behind. But at the same time, we got to realize that the visions that God's given us, right, when God said David will be king over Israel, what does it say? And this is the last verse I have. 2 Samuel 22, 21 to 23. This is at the end of David's life, right? Or wait, we're going to do 2 Samuel, or here, let's see. 22, how about 22 verse, or no, First Chronicles 11, sorry. 1 Chronicles 11, chapter 10. All right, chapter 10, verse 11. These are the chief of David's mighty men. And listen to this. The ones who linked arms with him as he took up his kingship. All right, and remember, God's speaking to us right now. These are the chiefs of David's mighty men, the ones who linked arms with him as he took up his kingship, with all Israel joining and helping him become the king, just in the way that God had spoken regarding Israel. Right? That's who they were. They linked arms with their leader to fulfill what God had spoken. And the last thing I want to share is in 2 Samuel 22, 21 to 23. When it's all said and done, even though it was David's mighty men that did a lot of the work, and it was David that was leading his men to do what God had commanded him to do. What does David say at the end of his life? He says, God made my life complete when I placed all the pieces before him. When I cleaned up my act, he gave me a fresh start. Indeed, I've kept alert to God's ways. I haven't taken for granted. Every day I review the ways he works. I try not to miss a trick. Now, I'll just stop there. Now, there's no hint in this line about, with my mighty men I accomplished this. Or with my great strength I accomplished this. It says, every day I review the ways that he works. Right? So we've got to get out of this mindset that we have to be reserved and set back and not take any of the glory. Because Those mighty men, as valiant as they were, and as dangerous as they were, and as much as the spotlight that they took, at the end of the day, it was God who got the spotlight. And it's him that will get the spotlight. But we have some giants to slay, and we have some water to get our leader, right? I want these stories to encourage you and to inspire you, right? To be the same kind of people, right? Gathered around our leader. Even though we were the misfits, we are now mighty men. And we have a lot of opportunities from now on, right? From now on. Now we have no excuse, right? Before we did, we could think, oh, maybe, I didn't know. Now we have no excuse, right? And the same with for me, right? I have no excuse. Now I can be the man that God's called me to be, and I can support the leader who he's given the vision to, and I can help him do what God has commanded him to do. Amen? Hallelujah.